In March 2010, the lifeless body of 28-year-old Janet Murphy was discovered in her modest apartment in Asheville, North Carolina. The shocking crime rattled the local police department where Janet had worked as a secretary, leading to an investigation that uncovered a web of corruption and betrayal. At the center of it all was Captain Nathaniel Barnes, a revered officer whose hidden ties to criminal activity and desperate attempts to cover his tracks culminated in murder. The story of Janet's final weeks and the unraveling of Barnes's secret life would become one of Asheville's most chilling cases, forever tarnishing the department's reputation and leaving a community reeling. On the morning of March 12, 2010, the normally quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove was rattled by a grim discovery. Janet Murphy, a vibrant and well-liked 28-year-old secretary for the Asheville Police Department, hadn't been seen for days. Her absence was odd. Janet was punctual, professional, and deeply rooted in her routines. When her neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Carter, noticed a strange smell seeping from Janet's apartment, concern turned to dread. Mrs. Carter, a retired teacher who had lived next door for over 2 decades, decided to call the police. The officers arrived at 9:15 a.m. Their arrival marked by the piercing wail of sirens that shattered the stillness of the early spring morning. Mrs. Carter, frail but determined, stood on her porch, wringing her hands as she spoke to the responding officers. She explained that she hadn't seen Janet in days and had assumed she was working late shifts, as she often did. But the smell, the sickly, metallic stench, was unlike anything she had experienced before. It was suffocating, clinging to the air like a heavy fog. When the officers entered Janet's modest one-bedroom apartment, the scene was unlike anything they had anticipated. The living room, once a space of warmth and cheer, was now chaotic and unrecognizable. A coffee table lay on its side, shattered glass from a decorative lamp glittering in the soft morning light. Cushions were thrown haphazardly across the room, and a faint trail of blood led from the living room carpet to the edge of the hallway. At 9:37 a.m., the officers discovered Janet's lifeless body sprawled across the bedroom floor. Her face was bruised, her neck bore deep, darkened marks of strangulation, and her usually tidy appearance was marred by the violence inflicted upon her. Her once bright eyes, now glassy and devoid of life, stared upward, frozen in an expression of terror and pain. The bedroom was equally disheveled, drawers pulled open, clothes scattered everywhere, as though someone had searched frantically for something. By 10 a.m., the crime scene had been secured, and the Asheville Police Department dispatched their top detectives, Matthew Crane and Olivia Jensen, to take over the case. Both were known for their tenacity and skill in unraveling even the most complex cases. Crane, a stoic man in his late 40s, had seen his fair share of tragedies, but still felt the familiar knot in his stomach as he stepped into the apartment. Jensen, younger and known for her keen intuition, immediately began surveying the scene with sharp focus. The absence of forced entry raised a red flag for the detectives. Janet was known to be cautious. She wouldn't have opened the door for just anyone. This indicated she likely knew her attacker. The bruising on her neck suggested a prolonged struggle, which led the detectives to believe the killer was someone who not only had access to her home, but had a reason to silence her so violently. By 11:15 a.m., Janet's estranged boyfriend, a local mechanic with a history of gambling and volatile outbursts, was identified as a potential suspect. His relationship with Janet had been tumultuous at best, with neighbors recalling loud arguments that often spilled out into the hallway. However, the detectives knew better than to latch onto the most obvious suspect too soon. The scene hinted at a more personal and calculated motive, something darker and more insidious. As they combed through the apartment, Crane's attention was drawn to a partially torn note wedged beneath the sofa. The paper was crumpled, as though it had been hastily discarded. Unfolding it carefully, Crane noticed two distinct initials written at the bottom. NB. It was a detail that would haunt both detectives for the rest of the day. Olivia Jensen, methodical and thorough, began piecing together Janet's last known movements. By 1 p.m., they confirmed that Janet had left work on the evening of March 10th, clocking out at 6:42 p.m. Her colleagues described her as distracted that day, glancing over her shoulder more than usual and clutching her handbag tightly. Some noted she seemed on edge, as though she was carrying a burden she couldn't share. The torn note bearing Oz NB took on a heavier significance when a junior officer quietly mentioned that those initials matched those of Captain Nathaniel Barnes, a decorated figure in the department. Known for his charisma and leadership, Barnes was an unlikely suspect at first glance. But the detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that someone in their own ranks might be connected to Janet's death. By 2:15 p.m., forensic teams began analyzing the scene, taking swabs, bagging evidence, and meticulously documenting the disarray. The team noted a broken picture frame on the floor, its glass cracked. The photo within was of Janet and her colleagues at a department event, smiling brightly. A closer look revealed Captain Barnes standing just behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. As the day wore on, the weight of the case began to settle on the detectives. Janet Murphy wasn't just another victim. She was someone they had worked alongside, someone who had brightened the department with her laughter and dedication. The reality of investigating her murder struck a deep emotional chord, particularly as they began to see glimpses of a life cut tragically short. By 5:30 p.m., the first day of the investigation came to an end, leaving more questions than answers. Who had entered Janet's apartment that night? What had driven them to such a brutal act? And, most chillingly, what did the initials MNB truly signify? February 2010 began as an ordinary month for Captain Nathaniel Barnes, a man who had spent his career building a reputation for integrity and leadership. At 52 years old, Barnes was seen as the backbone of the Asheville Police Department. His sharp uniform, commanding voice, and history of cracking high-profile cases made him a hero in the eyes of the community. But beneath the polished surface, Barnes carried a secret so dangerous it could destroy him: a 10-year connection to an underground criminal network. This network operated quietly, dealing in illegal gambling, smuggling, and laundering money through local businesses. Barnes had been their silent protector, ensuring evidence disappeared and investigations were derailed. In exchange, he enjoyed financial kickbacks that funded his comfortable lifestyle, including a sprawling home on the outskirts of town and his luxury car, a black BMW that always gleamed in the sun. For a decade, Barnes had managed to keep his illicit dealings hidden. But his carefully constructed facade began to crack when Janet Murphy stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. In her role as a secretary, Janet handled administrative tasks with precision. She was thorough, detail-oriented, and often worked late hours to stay ahead. Her co-workers admired her for her dedication, but few truly knew her. Janet, now 28 years old, had endured a difficult life. Raised in the foster care system, she had learned to rely on herself from a young age. Her job at the police department wasn't just a paycheck. It was her way of proving to herself and the world that she could rise above her circumstances. On a quiet evening in early February 2010, Janet stayed late at the department, organizing old case files and cross-referencing reports. As she sifted through documents, her sharp eyes caught something odd. A series of financial records marked closed in official reports didn't add up. Large sums of money had been transferred to accounts linked to shell companies, and there were unusual discrepancies in several investigation logs. Names of local businesses, previously flagged for illegal activities, appeared repeatedly in reports that had mysteriously gone cold. At first, Janet dismissed it as a clerical error, but her curiosity got the better of her. She began digging deeper, cross-referencing these anomalies with other records. Over the next few days, a chilling pattern emerged. The same initials, NB, signed off on nearly every questionable case. Slowly, the pieces fell into place. Captain Nathaniel Barnes, the department's golden boy, wasn't just complicit in criminal activity, he was orchestrating it. Realizing the gravity of her discovery, Janet felt a wave of panic. She knew she couldn't confront Barnes directly. He was powerful, respected, and capable of discrediting or silencing her. At first, she considered ignoring what she had found, telling herself it wasn't her problem. But the thought of letting criminals walk free and enabling Barnes's corruption gnawed at her. Janet decided to collect evidence, with the hope of anonymously exposing him. Her once routine days became a careful balancing act. By day, she maintained her cheerful demeanor at work, exchanging polite pleasantries with Barnes, who often passed by her desk with a warm smile. By night, she meticulously copied documents, downloaded files, and kept a journal detailing her findings. She stored everything on a USB drive, hiding it in a box of old keepsakes under her bed. As February 2010 turned into March, Janet began to notice subtle but unsettling changes. One evening, while walking home from work, she sensed a car trailing behind her. She turned quickly, catching a glimpse of a familiar black BMW before it sped off into the night. Another time, she returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing, but her belongings had been subtly disturbed, as though someone had been searching for something. The paranoia crept in, making her hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Phone calls from unknown numbers began to interrupt her evenings. When she answered, there was silence on the other end, before the line went dead. At work, Barnes became unusually attentive. He would linger near her desk, casually asking how she was doing or commenting on how quiet things had been lately. His tone was friendly, but Janet couldn't shake the feeling that his words carried an underlying threat. By March 10th, 2010, Janet's fear had reached its peak. That evening, she made the decision to leave a voicemail for Detective Olivia Jensen. In her message, she didn't name Barnes directly, but hinted at corruption within the department. Her voice trembled as she spoke, urging Jensen to look deeper into financial records and past cases. Janet didn't leave her name, hoping to remain anonymous for as long as possible. Later that same night, Barnes showed up at Janet's apartment. She hadn't told anyone where she lived, But Barnes's presence confirmed her worst fears. He had been watching her. He entered under the pretense of concern, but his demeanor was anything but comforting. Inside the small, dimly lit apartment, the tension was suffocating. Janet stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. She accused Barnes of corruption and threatened to expose him, clutching the USB drive in her hand like a lifeline. Barnes, visibly shaken but composed, tried to reason with her, his voice calm but his eyes filled with fury. The argument escalated, turning into a shouting match. In a moment of desperation, Janet tried to make a break for the door, but Barnes grabbed her arm, pulling her back with brutal force. What happened next was a blur of rage and fear. In his panic, Barnes strangled Janet, his hands tightening around her neck until her body went limp. For a moment, the room fell silent, save for the sound of Barnes's ragged breathing. As the reality of what he had done sank in, he staggered back, staring at Janet's lifeless form on the floor. Over the next few hours, Barnes meticulously cleaned the apartment, wiping down surfaces and removing anything that could link him to the crime. He gathered Janet's notes and papers, searching frantically for any copies of the evidence she had collected. But he overlooked the torn note under the sofa, and most importantly, the USB drive Janet had hidden earlier that evening. By the early hours of March 11th, 2010, Barnes left the apartment, confident that he had erased all traces of his presence. But in his haste, he had underestimated Janet's resourcefulness. The evidence she had compiled would soon resurface, setting the stage for his eventual downfall. The investigation into Janet Murphy's murder began as a slow and meticulous process. But by March 15th, 2010, 3 days after her body was discovered, detectives Matthew Crane and Olivia Jensen found themselves facing mounting questions about the people closest to her. Barnes, the well-respected police captain, was initially approached as a colleague and witness. However, inconsistencies in his behavior and statements quickly drew their attention. When Barnes was questioned about his whereabouts on March 10th, 2010, the night Janet was last seen alive, he provided an alibi. He claimed he had been at home reviewing departmental reports and making phone calls related to an upcoming community outreach program. At first glance, his account seemed plausible, but small cracks began to appear upon closer scrutiny. For one, there was no corroboration. His wife was out of town visiting her sister, and Barnes claimed no one had visited or called him that evening. By March 18th, 2010, Crane and Jensen revisited Barnes's alibi, combing through phone records and other data. His call logs, while active earlier in the day, showed no activity past 8:30 p.m., which was unusual for a man often described as a workaholic. The detectives couldn't ignore how strangely disconnected Barnes seemed when speaking about Janet. While he expressed sadness and regret about her death, his words lacked the personal warmth expected of someone mourning a colleague they worked with daily. A breakthrough came on March 20th, 2010, when surveillance footage from a convenience store near Janet's apartment was retrieved. The grainy but clear footage captured a black BMW pulling into the parking lot around 9:45 p.m. on the night of the murder. The vehicle remained parked for 10 minutes before leaving in the direction of Janet's building. The timestamp aligned with the time investigators believed Janet's killer had arrived. The footage didn't show the driver, but it was widely known in the department that Barnes drove a black BMW, always meticulously clean and hard to miss. The video evidence added to Crane and Jensen's growing suspicion. Barnes, once thought untouchable, was becoming a central figure in their investigation. However, the detectives knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to implicate someone as powerful as Barnes. His position in the department and his carefully curated image made him a formidable opponent. By March 23, 2010, another revelation surfaced that shifted the course of the case. A young woman named Melanie Harper contacted the police. She was an old friend of Janet's, someone Janet had trusted during difficult times. Melanie explained that she had received a package from Janet on March 9, 2010, just one day before her murder. The package, postmarked and labeled with Janet's handwriting, contained a USB drive and a brief note. The note, written in Janet's hurried scrawl, instructed Melanie to deliver the drive to a trusted authority if anything happened to her. When the USB drive was opened on March 24, 2010, its contents stunned the detectives. The drive contained a trove of incriminating evidence against Barnes. There were detailed financial records showing payments funneled to him through shell companies, emails between Barnes and known figures in the criminal underworld, and photos of confidential police files marked as classified that Barnes had deliberately altered or destroyed. Each file painted a damning picture of Barnes as a man who had spent years abusing his power for personal gain. The evidence also included a folder titled Personal Notes, which appeared to be Janet's private documentation of her suspicions. She had chronicled her growing fear of Barnes, detailing how she had noticed him watching her, following her, and subtly intimidating her in the weeks leading up to her death. Her notes included chilling descriptions of her paranoia, of finding her apartment disturbed, and of the late-night phone calls that ended in silence. Janet's final note on the USB drive was particularly haunting. She wrote about her decision to expose Barnes, even though she feared the consequences. She described feeling trapped, torn between doing the right thing and protecting herself, but ultimately chose the path of integrity. It was a choice that cost her life. By March 26, 2010, the detectives had built a strong case against Barnes. They reviewed the files repeatedly, astonished by the depth of his deception. What struck them most wasn't just the criminal acts, but how personal the evidence felt. Janet had taken great care to document everything, and her meticulous nature ensured that nothing was left to interpretation. Every file, every photo, and every note told the story of a woman who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. As Crane and Jensen pieced together the timeline, they began to see the full picture. Barnes, desperate to protect his secret life, had been driven to murder. Janet's discovery of his illegal dealings had set off a chain of events that Barnes couldn't control. What he hadn't counted on was Janet's bravery and foresight. Even in the face of fear, she had ensured her story wouldn't be silenced. The case against Barnes was growing stronger, but the detectives knew they would have to confront him directly. The evidence on the USB drive was damning, but Barnes had spent years mastering the art of manipulation. Crane and Jensen braced themselves for what they knew would be a battle of wills, one that would test their own resolve as they sought justice for Janet Murphy. On the morning of April 20th, 2010, the Asheville Police Department became the scene of an unthinkable moment. Officers who had worked for years alongside Captain Nathaniel Barnes stood frozen as he was led out of the building in handcuffs. Barnes, the man they had admired and trusted, was now accused of a crime that had shaken the department to its core. The arrest, carefully timed to avoid early media attention, unfolded just after 8 a.m. Barnes arrived at work like it was any other day, parking his spotless black BMW in its usual spot. He greeted his colleagues with his familiar confidence as he walked through the doors, unaware of what awaited him. A few minutes later, Detectives Crane and Jensen entered his office. What followed was swift. Barnes initially tried to maintain his composure, but his shock was evident. By 9:15 a.m., a crowd of officers, staff, and even some civilians had gathered in the parking lot, drawn by whispers of the arrest. Barnes, sharply dressed as always, kept his head high as he was escorted to a waiting squad car. However, the tension on his face betrayed him. Some colleagues turned away, unable to reconcile this moment with the man they thought they knew. Inside the interrogation room, Barnes attempted to deflect blame. He claimed the evidence against him was fabricated and insisted Janet's death was a tragic accident that had spiraled out of control. His voice was steady, but his trembling hands told another story. As the hours passed, Detectives Crane and Jensen presented the mounting evidence. They showed him surveillance footage of his car near Janet's apartment on March 10, 2010, the torn note with his initials, and the USB drive containing financial records, and Janet's detailed documentation of his illegal activities. Barnes's calm facade began to crack. He grew evasive, his frustration visible as each new piece of evidence tightened the noose around him. By 2:30 p.m., Barnes's narrative had unraveled. Crane and Jensen, relentless in their questioning, exposed every gap in his story. The once revered captain was no longer in control, and the weight of his actions became impossible to deny. In the weeks that followed, preparation for the trial began. By June 2010, the case had captured national attention, and the courtroom was packed on the first day of proceedings. Reporters filled the back rows, eager to capture every detail. Assistant District Attorney Caroline Hayes led the prosecution with precision, presenting Barnes as a man who had abused his power for years to shield himself from accountability. She detailed his connections to an underground criminal network and his desperate attempts to silence Janet when she uncovered the truth. The evidence was damning: the surveillance footage, the torn note, and the USB drive painted a clear picture of Barnes's guilt. Janet's meticulous documentation revealed her growing fear as she prepared to expose him, and her final notes, written in her own hand, brought the courtroom to silence. Janet's bravery was undeniable, and her words left a profound impact on everyone present. Testimonies from Janet's friends and colleagues further strengthened the case. Melanie Harper, who had received Janet's USB drive, spoke tearfully about their friendship and Janet's paranoia in her final weeks. Her account of Janet's determination to expose the truth, despite her fears, moved many to tears. Barnes's defense team, led by high-profile attorney Martin Gresham, tried to discredit the evidence. They claimed the case was circumstantial and painted Janet as a troubled woman who misunderstood Barnes's actions. They argued her death was accidental, but their polished arguments failed to counter the overwhelming weight of the evidence. By June 28, 2010, the jury reached its verdict. After 6 hours of deliberation, Barnes was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the verdict was read. Janet's friends and family wept quietly, their relief tempered by the enduring pain of her loss. Barnes sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly, his face pale as the reality set in. On July 5, 2010, Barnes was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His fall from grace marked the end of a case that shook Asheville to its core. For the community, it was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and corruption. For Janet's loved ones, it was bittersweet justice for the woman who lost her life fighting for the truth. As Barnes was led away from the courtroom, the echoes of his betrayal lingered. The man once seen as a symbol of integrity and justice was now remembered as a warning of what happens when power turns to greed. Janet's story, though tragic, became a lasting testament to her courage and determination to do what was right. Barnes is sentenced to life in prison without parole. The department undergoes a massive overhaul, with several officers investigated for ties to Barnes's criminal network. Detective Jensen, deeply affected by the case, vows to honor Janet's bravery by fighting corruption within law enforcement. Janet's story becomes a symbol of courage, and her name is etched into Asheville's memory as the woman who exposed a dangerous secret, even at the cost of her life. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates. And check out another insane case we've covered. The case where a highway patrol officer murders his female co-worker to hide a secret affair. Don't forget to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comment section.